And we have begun. So, effectively, I anticipated there would be a lot of questions regarding this particular topic over time, is over the next week or so. Everybody has questions. Look, this is how you figure out your grade. If you're not sure, just flip me an email and I'll look it up. Vis-a-vis, whether or not you want to take the final or not. It's your call. I mean, there's 3 exams out of 4. They're all weighted the same. That was a change that we made a while ago. So, for instance, if you had an A, a C plus, a B minus, 4.0, 2.67, 2.33. This one's easy. You're not even by intent. So if you add that up, you get 9 quality points. You divide by 3, 3.0. Where I come from, we call that a B. If you're happy with a B, here's a B. See it. Just inform me whether you want to take the final, whether you're choosing not to take the final. Okay, that's all. That's how you work. If you're not sure of your grading or how it works, please let me know. I'll be glad to do it for you, to assist you. And you make up your own mind. Everybody has some people need to have a C to advance in their program. Many people need to have a B. As long as it starts with a B, in other words, a B minus, is effectively the grade that qualifies you vis-a-vis nursing. There's no such thing as a C minus. We go C to D. Okay, I think it's my recollection. It's the way things work here when we post our final grades. Ergo, there's a lot of room between D and C. I tend to, if it looks like it's close enough, I'm going with that so people get at least credit for doing the class. You got it? Do it all the time. So you make up that decision. Also, vis-a-vis the final, I sent you a variety of messages. I've got nothing better to do. I can only cook so many turkeys. We did turkey breast this year in the Instant Pot. Oh, what a win. Oh, easy. Oh, easy. Oh, my God. Got to do that more. But we only had a few. If I had more than a handful of people, I would do the whole 9 yards. Nevertheless, so the final is being offered at, count them, 4 different times. I mean, I have 5 different finals to give. I mean, depending on, not in this particular class, in one of the classes, that the final is the very last final period, which is Friday at whatever, 1 p.m. of the 12th, so I'm anticipating we're going to have people from that moving into one of these. So if you're planning to take the final at the regular time, and you're planning to take the final, B, you're taking it at the regular time, no need to notify me. Okay. But if you're for some reason wish to take it at a different time, and this group probably is less likely than more likely, you must notify me so I know who's where. Because if there's a space for room, whoever's final it is, whenever this time is for this group, you get first call on seats. Then somebody else taking the final would have to wait. The final's not any different than a regular test. It's probably going to have maybe 70 questions. So it's not going to take an excessively long period of time, but you have the full 2 hours. And remember, it's open book. Open note, open book, open computer, phone, laptop. You can't bring your best friend who's an anatomy scholar or hire a professor from another university. You can't do that. So I would be intrigued if you did that. You all clear on that? Surprisingly good mood considering the abysmal display in the second half yesterday. Thankfully, Manchester United won, and I can breathe. And I found my king, as you can see, sweatshirt. Yes, my wife has a queen sweatshirt. Okay, enough of the fancy panther. Let's get questions, answers. Anybody nobody feels a need to speak? That's good. I will take over that department. I understand You told me you didn't do a lot on the spinal cord. I'll make it quick. You do need to know about it. Okay. Significant differences. Not a lot goes on in the spinal cord. It's basically sending signals out and bringing signals in. It doesn't do, there's no conscious activity whatsoever. There's no higher order functioning. It merely consists of things going in and going out. You remember all those wonderful vertebral arches, they make up a vertebral column, all those wonderful vertebrae that you're familiar with. It starts at the foramen magnum. Effectively, that's the dividing line between the brainstem, anatomically, and the start of the spinal cord. It's relatively abrupt, the transition, anatomically speaking, microscopically speaking, or macroscopically speaking. And it ends roughly at L1 or L2. Why is that? Because the spinal cord doesn't elongate as rapidly as bones do. Okay, the bones grow faster than the relatively limited amount of lengthening of the spinal cord. And this is useful because it gives us the ability, because of that, to have an area where we can effectively, easily is the wrong way, we can access spinal cord fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and assess it. And it's an extraordinarily important thing. We call it a spinal centesis, centesis. That's a fancy word for poking a hole in something, or lumbar puncture, or spinal tap, if you want to use the vernacular. Got it? And I'll show you why. We can do that there. Terrible illustrations. My lousy illustration up there is probably as good as any of these. You have two enlargements in the cervical area, and effectively they call it lumbar, but it's really lumbosacral area. And that's because in the upper extremity, all the stuff coming in and out is there. In the lower extremity, it's there. The cord ends roughly at L1, L2, and there's a certain variation here. So here, there's a sacrum here. So the area is basically vertebrae L3, L4, and L5. Remember, spinal nerves exit typically below. So if this was C8, nerve would go below. If this was T1, the nerve typically goes out below. The nerves still come out. Nerves going out, signals coming out and in. Next, sensory and motor. And what happens is, okay, it gives you this space. The termination ends somewhat conically in space and shape. So anatomists back in the day, using the Latin, called it the conus medullaris. Remember, the medulla is the interior. Important terms. But we call it the medullary cone. Either term works. I think from a test perspective, yes, it's on the test. Conus medullaris. And so that's a sugar cone, not a cake cone. I'm thinking cone. So it conically terminates there, tapers, and then there's a tiny filament of connective tissue covered in meningeal tissue called the filum terminale, or terminal filament. That attaches it, tethers it to the sacrum, goes through the sacrum, and is anchored within the sacrum. So effectively the cord, and this is important, why we can't do a spinal tap up here, okay, is unfortunately, and the spinal fluid is on the exterior, okay, as well as floating in the interior. Remember, there's spinal fluid in what's called the subarachnoid space, spinal fluid in what's called the central canal. So we can access, and I'll show you diagrammatically how it works. Illustrating with one of the slides up here. Can't do it here because if you poke a needle and the spinal cord isn't going to give, it's not going to move. But all of the nerves below L1 and L2 come out through their opening. So this is L3, this is L4. The nerve comes out, but it doesn't necessarily come out this way. They come out going farther and farther down, even those openings in the sacrum. Remember you looked at the sacrum in the lab? You had those anterior and posterior foramina. Those are where the nerves come in out. So we have a name for it. When they dissected it out, took out the spinal cord, pulled all the nerves out, there were these long strands and it looked like a horse's tail. So they named it the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. So those are important terms anatomically speaking. Not so hard. Moving on. So you can see them here. It's again, they use that little green thing for the phylum terminale, and you can see kind of where it is. So the big deal is the difference. The meninges or meninges, whatever you want to call them, are interesting in the brain because they have open spaces between them. This is something that I recorded and sent to you. It is different around the spinal cord. They don't have these little pockets called sinuses, which really are ways for the cerebrospinal fluid to be returned to the general circulation. They have little overflow valves called arachnoid granulations that are in those sinuses. So we don't have this split. The dura up there, remember there are three areas, dura mater, arachnoid, because the material has little strands that look like a spider web. And then close adherent to the spine and adherent to the brain is called pia, which means soft or delicate matter. Dura for durable, strong, and it's very strong. You have the same layers in the spinal cord, but the layers in the spinal cord don't have a separation. Okay? You don't have one that's periosteal on the undersurface of the bone, and you don't have one that's effectively surrounding and reinforcing the area internally. So you got space. Different. Coming up. So protected by bone, the meningeal layers and cerebrospinal fluid. The dura mater only one layer thick and is not adherent to the vertebrae. It's important too. So what surrounds it exteriorly to protect it, as it does a lot of important things in your body, like your heart, like your kidneys, is fat. We call that the epidural fat, which has fat, veins, etc., blood vessels. The usual culprits are always in this area. The cerebrospinal fluid is in the subarachnoid space, as well as in that central canal, that opening that we will see shortly, that goes down the spinal cord. As you can see, the dura and the arachnoid extend to the sacrum, and it's in that area below L1 and L2 that we can do a lumbar puncture, tap, whatever word you want to call it. Bless you. All important. This is the distinction between an epidural and a spinal. Whether you're want to be a nurse anesthetist, and typically anesthesiologists do spinal anesthesia. Nurse anesthetists typically do not. They might do it under close supervision. I don't know what is done today. That's a relatively tricky procedure to perform. I have never done one. Just to be completely transparent about it. An epidural, most people are familiar with because when someone's in labor, and it's called understand this is the distinction between analgesia and anesthesia, terms that you should be familiar with. An epidural is an analgesic. It relieves pain. It is not an anesthetic. They're using some anesthetic to do it, but it doesn't. Anesthesia means the absence of pain, the absence of sensation. So when you're giving an epidural, it is really modifying the amount of pain that one perceives. It seems like you're not feeling any pain if it's done properly. Do not ask my daughter about it. It was not done well for her. She wasn't a happy camper with that epidural. We digress. But a spinal anesthetic is different. That is where the injection is directly into the cerebrospinal fluid. And it's very, very careful because it can cause big problems if it goes up. If you didn't know it, they actually weight the material to make sure it doesn't circulate back to the brain and particularly cause somebody to die. That's why there's a whole lot of nuances. Very interesting area. Voila. So here we are. So they would insert a needle just into this fatty area if you're doing an epidural that you hear about so much in labor and delivery. But if it goes through, and that's why somebody has to know what they're doing, if you inadvertently go through the connective tissue, you have to puncture through the dura, which is very strong, and be in this relatively small space where the cerebrospinal fluid is. This is a needle with a catheter. Same thing that you would have if you were starting an IV. So the catheter is a needle within a needle. This is a hollow needle. So what happens is you pull out that needle and the spinal fluid will drip out there, and you have 3 little test tubes and you collect it. the way it works. Unless they changed it dramatically over the years that I've seen one done. Again, I've never done one, but I've seen them done. Okay? That's the difference. And the reason you can do it is because if you're going to hit something on your way in, if it's part of the cauda equina, they're not tethered, they're not held, they can move. So I mean, you can take something, if you hit it and it's tethered, you're going to damage it. But if you hit it and it moves, it'll just push out of the way. The needle isn't that large. People are doing it very carefully. That's why we can do that procedure. Okay? Voila. So they're showing you the layers that are here. So here you have the dura, and then underneath the dura, this is this so-called subarachnoid space. It's really not very large, as much as you would see if you go back and look at the illustrations from 12C at the bottom, at the latter portion of that PowerPoint, all the way into here. And you can see the cauda is here. Okay. So conus medullaris, biome terminale, all the way to the coccyx, covered with pia. Okay. So it's still covered with the connective tissue that's consistent with, okay, the meninges. These are, you don't have to know about these. These are little extensions. They call them ligaments. They're really pia mater, and they're just securing the nerves when the nerves are exiting in certain areas. Here are the enlargements. Again, in and out from the upper and lower extremities. These are part of peripheral nervous system. I'm not doing them. I'm going to tell who's ever doing, since I'm doing all this, that I didn't do peripheral nervous system. You did cranial nerves, correct? And that was the extent of it. You didn't do like musculocutaneous, radial and axillary nerve. You didn't do those. You didn't do plexus and stuff like that. Who's ever doing it, I'll let them know that's where they got to start. Okay. Cauda equina. Collection of nerves, same stupid illustration. Better look. These are, they call these little things rootlets. And what they are, when you think of a nerve, it's not a solid structure coming out of the spinal cord. There's tiny little branches that connect into one big, what we call a nerve. So it's the difference when somebody has, like I had, a disc that bulged. Mine wasn't characterized by pain. Mine was characterized by numbness. And the numbness is persistent. So I damaged the sensory area more or less permanently, and the only thing I have is numbness from it. I get down on my hands and knees. I can't, this whole right area, I can feel it's numb right now. It hasn't impeded the motor activity from it whatsoever. It's just the way it works. Okay? So understand it depends on what rootlet was bothered by all of this. Moving on, you don't see a lot here. Not going into the sulci. Here you can see the conus. This is the phylum terminale, and you can see, imagine they teased it out and it looked like a horse's tail. And this is cord anatomy, which I'm not going to do so much. There's when they talk about a fissure, the difference between a fissure and a sulcus, okay, probably has to do with the degree of depth of the opening. I don't want to go crazy about that. If you go into a graduate level type of anatomy, they'll look more at that. The central canal is the continuation of the ventricles. The fourth ventricle leads into the central canal basically at the inferior aspect of the medulla oblongata and continues. Voila. This is classic spinal cord. Okay, we know that's cervical because of that. You have to distinguish between vertebrae in different regions. That's called the bifid spinous process. It's forked. Has a lot to do with all the ligaments that are helping secure your head. So you can see that. And so here you can see it. It's got that butterfly shape of gray matter with this, what they call this area, the central commissure, because again, it's fibers that crisscross through there. But effectively, it's gray matter. You can see that little opening is the central canal in it. And so the gray matter is called horns. The white matter is called columns. So you have dorsal and ventral. We use those terms. The first area described anatomically was the nervous system in the brain. So we don't use anterior and posterior, even though they are, you wouldn't be wrong saying that necessarily. We tend to use dorsal and ventral. You use traditional Because if they're looking at the spinal cord of an animal, let's say a dog who's on all fours, you have dorsal as essentially their back and ventral is their belly. That's where those terms came from originally, anatomical. So we used a lot of those terms, dorsal and ventral, rather than anterior and posterior. Just, and again, you have the luxury of asking me if I happen to use one term or the other, if they're interchangeable. But be aware of that going forward. You won't have the luxury on a standardized test. Moving on. So dorsal horn, ventral horn. In the thoracic area, there's a lateral horn. That's just anatomical. Don't worry about it. And these are called columns. White matter are called columns. So you have a dorsal column, you have a ventral column, and you have lateral columns. Same illustration. Here are those neat little rootlets. You can see the adherence here of the meningeal layers, the pia directly adherent, the arachnoid here. Again, in this space between those two is where the cerebrospinal fluid is, and the dura. Very commissure. That's really, for now, that's what you need to know. All I can think of is you need to know we're not going to do any of this stuff, where it's located. It's mapped out. I don't want to go crazy with it. I know with my advanced anatomy class, we talk about this. We talk about different tracks that are there. And I have a little to tell you with that before we move on. And I introduce, in the time we have today, the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to do both Wednesday and Friday and be done with it. My plan is to be here on Monday and basically have some degree of review that's here for those who wish to attend. I got to be here, so you want to, it's your call. If you're not taking the final, don't attend. Sleep in. Other than you have to come. Don't start. It's okay. You're showing up too. I digress. Yeah, ascending, descending. We did that. We already did that number. Important terms, remember? Projection fibers, commissural fibers, white matter. Got it? Good. Voila, voila, voila. And more pictures. This is interesting. Just for reference, red are motor, descending. Blue are sensory. The dorsal columns, tremendous amount. All those proprioceptors I droned on endlessly about, close your eyes, you know where your hands are, blah, 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 blah. Romberg sign, all that stuff. This is all the information that's coming up through them. There's a tremendous amount of information. That's why we've seen, like I said, when we talk in micro, if you have me, we talk about syphilis, it affects those. And imagine how it distorts all the sensory information. That's why people have a very difficult time walking. They have that. And there's other diseases that are involved. So what's important, I will get to. The red ones are motor. This is when you talk about the pyramids, pyramidal tracts, corticospinal from the cerebral cortex, instructions to move something to the spine. And basically you can see there's both lateral and ventral. You can see them over in both of these areas. Here's the ventral ones, lateral ones. And this is important vis-a-vis spinal cord. For instance, my absence of sensation, a paresthesia, by definition, is a sensation that's there that ought to be there. Needles and pins. We've all had our leg or our arm fall asleep. Then you're experiencing paresthesia as it comes back to normal. My degree of limited sensation, if any, in my knee is a kind of paresthesia. Damage to something involving the sensory tracts. Paralysis implies motor function. And this is important because it depends. Flaccid paralysis means no signal is getting through to the muscle. Spastic means there's getting an overabundance of signals, none of which tell it to relax. There are different diseases that do this significantly. So flaccid, means the damage was to the ventral root or ventral horn cells. It doesn't get to the muscles. If muscles don't get signal, for whatever reason, they atrophy. Surely, the most famous infection and disease that caused this by far and away, polio. You're all immunized. We are all immunized for polio. I talk about it a lot in micro. Why? Because the research was done where? Right here in Pittsburgh. That's where the vaccine came from. One of our professors, I'll reiterate this point, who's retired now, was actually worked on the development of the very famous Jonas Salk vaccine, which we don't use. Back in the 50s, medical doctor was a professor here. Moving on. So flaccid paralysis, that's when you see somebody typically with spinal cord damage. This is the kind of paralysis. They can't use their muscles. Spastic paralysis, okay, involves something from the brain going to the spinal cord. We refer to them as it's a two-nerve circuit. Better way to phrase it. The nerve circuit from your brain to the spinal cord is called the upper motor neuron. The circuit from the spinal cord to the muscle is called lower motor neuron. Two-nerve circuit. Remember, I talked about that? They could each be a meter long if somebody's like, say, 6'3", 6'4". For most of it, those two nerves are probably 2.5 feet long. Easy. So flaccid involves in some way, shape, or form the lower motor neuron signal going to the muscle, not getting there. Spastic, upper motor neuron. What happens is when the damage is from the brain to the spinal cord, those nerves begin to produce remember I told you this was almost always excitatory? Glutamate. Glutamate causes every signal going to the muscle saying fire, fire, fire. What happens, flexors always overpower extensors. That's why in a stroke, and that's classically where it is, they have spastic contractions. Everything we do to try to spastic paralysis. So the muscles will often shorten, as I was demonstrating, permanently. That's a hard rehab case to deal with. So in spinal cord trauma, which we see, paraplegia means you can still use your upper extremities. So if the cord is transected between T1 and its termination is that person loses whatever lower extremity function is there. Quadriplegia in the cervical region. There are varying degrees. And so, and there's a fine line between shock and damage. Maybe the case, there's so many, I'm trying to think of the right ones to describe to you that are there. There's spinal shock is interesting. Typically that occurs when somebody transiently loses it and they can't move it. You see it in the football field where they're very worried that somebody can't move and they cart them off. They put the neck brace on because you have no idea. They could really be in mortal peril, literally. And they have to be very careful and do all that kind of stuff to make sure they don't damage it. And the trainers and physicians are right there. They know exactly what they're doing, all that good stuff. And then magically, all of a sudden you hear, oh, he's moving his arms and legs in the locker room and everybody's, applauding and very encouraged. That's spinal shock. Sometimes it takes days. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll administer steroids to reduce swelling and chill the person. Because they're trying, when you lower that basal metabolic rate by basically packing them in ice or something similar, you're buying yourself some time for the damage. There's a lot of things. It's very, very well understood. It's not the same. If the damage is permanent, it's permanent. Maybe a good example is Ryan Shazier, who played for the Steelers. He tackled with his head in a bad position, went down right away against Cincinnati a few years ago. A tremendous player. And you knew then. He returned. He did not gain full control. He got some of his, he can walk, he'll be on the sidelines, he can function, all of those types of things. Unfortunately, I can tell you how many students, do you think he'll ever play again? I didn't give him a quick answer. No. One, I didn't think he would recover fully. And two, more importantly, there isn't an insurance company in the world that will no doctor will say he's okay to play because he'll get sued. Ridiculous. Sometimes you have to understand money plays a significant role in these things. So transient period of spinal shock here. This is the classic. So polio, what it does is the virus, for whatever reason, affects those motor ventral horn gray matter cells, and the muscles atrophy. The big problem is it inevitably will infect respiratory muscles, and if that is the case, years ago we did not have ventilator technology to keep people alive. They used a thing called an iron lung, and you basically, if you look it up, you'll see images of it. They were surrounded. I treated a lot of patients because they were born before polio vaccine. Most famously, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a 4-term president in this year, United States, okay, had polio. That's why they never saw him. He always made sure he was already upright and standing and holding on to something. He was giving a speech. He did all these fireside chats where he was seated. He wanted to hide people, particularly because he was during World War II, and he died almost immediately before the end of it, that they wouldn't see him being impaired and think he was impaired. He was not physically, he was certainly not mentally impaired. And we'll get into where that comes from, and that was a kind of polio syndrome that was there. So that's the famous lower, so a stroke affects the upper motor neuron. Polio, famous lower motor neuron disease. This is both. Most of you have heard about it. A lot of very well-known people. Unfortunately, there's always making a big deal out of ALS. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It didn't have a name. They kind of called it a motor neuron disease back in the day, and now that it was associated very famously with one of the all-time greatest baseball players, Lou Gehrig, who played 2,190 consecutive games, which was the record until Cal Ripken Jr. broke it, 25, 30 years ago. And at that point, and when the record ended, he died a couple of years later, very, very famous. You can still see the speech that he gave, and it affects both upper and motor neurons. It affects the motor neurons in going to the muscle and the fibers of the pyramidal tract. And the tragedy of this is you don't lose your cognitive abilities, but you physically are unable to use your muscles. The late Dr. Stephen Hawking, okay? Most students, I don't know if you guys did it, a lot of students had to read a very skinny book that was wonderful called Tuesdays with Maury. Does that ring a bell for anybody? It came out, it was written by a guy named Mitch Albom, who's a sports writer. And his mentor, Brandeis College or University, wherever it's in Vermont, a guy named Maury Schwartz, was a sociology professor, and he kept in touch with him. And then as time went on, he found out he had ALS. And he used to visit him every Tuesday. And basically, like half of the profits went to research about this very successful book. And I mean, you could read it in an evening, that kind of a book. But it sort of summed up all things that were going on in this man's life, his interactions with people. And it was very much of an education for kind of an obnoxious, wise guy, smart-ass sports reporter. So, I mean, I'm surprised that he had some wonderful books, still does write a fair amount. And here's the glutamate aspect of it that plays such a role. And that's what they're looking at, trying to find ways to treat it. Okay. There is a treatment, it's not been very successful. So you have a lot of very well-known people have suffered with this. So the fancy name, again, there's also, and this is an important word to remember, it's called decussation. It's effectively when the fibers crisscross, whether it's in the medulla with the pyramidal cells or here, most pathways cross over. They're very much symmetrical. And so going up, it's not a 2-nerve circuit, it's a 3-nerve circuit. We call them first, second, and third order nerves or neurons. And I'll just show them to you. Basically, the first nerve is bringing the signal in. I touched something, I felt it. Bringing it in to the spinal cord. Cutaneous receptors, proprioceptors. Okay? In the spinal cord, eventually it meets up with what's called a second order neuron. That typically goes from the spinal cord, typically, to the thalamus. And remember what the thalamus is. It's the relay center to the appropriate part of the body. That's called the third order neuron. So effectively, they're all in between, other than the original sensory neuron, the sensory nerve. I touched this. Let's say I touched it and it was hot. Ooh. Okay. That basically is a 3-nerve circuit to finally get to your brain where now you know it's hot. In the meantime, your reflexes took over and you pulled your hand away. It's called withdrawal. And so without going crazy about that, the big pathways for this are called the spinothalamics. Okay? Pain, hot, cold, general touch, but really hot, cold, sharp, dull, pain, spinothalamics. They tell you where they're going. The nerve goes to the spinal cord, to the thalamus, and the thalamus relays it to the appropriate part of the brain. Dope, you just burned your fingers. I think I managed to get only one little cut chopping vegetables. And that's as far as we need to go. There's some illustrations here, but that's all I really have to say to you about spinal cord. I'll let you know exactly what's going on with regard to this. I'm not doing indirect or direct. You just heard about upper and lower motor neurons, and not going crazy over all this. My advanced class does this. Yeah, I think that we're done with this particular chapter, thankfully. Good. We begin the last chapter, and I'll introduce it in the time we have left. That's the one I just sent to you. That is 14. The autonomic, and if you want to call it automatic nervous system, I'm good with that. It's a great chapter to end AP1 with, because the watchword for all of how your body works, the very first week of class, we talked about homeostasis. This is homeostasis. And it's not hard to understand. You have 2 nerves. These are effectively motor nerves. Fancy name, we call it the visceral motor system. There's 2 parts of it. One is called sympathetic. That's the action division. And the other is parasympathetic. So again, the action division. Okay. That idiot cutting you off. It's like, all of a sudden your heart races. We call that fight or flight. That's full-blown sympathetic activity. If you know all the stuff that happens then, my heart accelerates, my eyes are wide open, my breathing increases, my respiratory passageways, this is important, increase, all of that stuff goes on. And we'll go into it in detail. All that things that get you ready for action, we call fight or flight. That's how it's defined. We've all experienced it. That's sympathetic. The other one is parasympathetic. If you know what happens with sympathetic, the opposite is parasympathetic. They are yin and yang. They are They have a physical tug of war within your system, keeping everything in balance. Don't say it. Nobody will know what reference you're making. If I said balanced grasshopper, you would have no clue WTF I'm talking about. None of you. You're all looking at me like, WTF is he talking about? Admit it. From a TV show from 50 years ago. Nobody cares, Luke. Nobody cares. So, autonomic or automatic nervous system, motor nerves only. They innervate all the stuff we have no control over. Smooth muscles, those wonderful hollow tubes circulating your blood, taking care of digestion, making sure genitourinary things are in order, respiratory passageways. That's what they do. Okay, smooth muscles, heart muscle, glands. So that whole fight or flight thing, all of a sudden, you dry up. That's because it tells your salivary glands to stop salivating. Why? So you won't get clogged, so you can breathe better. Interestingly, as you will learn, preoperatively, we give people a medication to do that. You don't want all those secretions if you have to intubate somebody. See, this is the relevant part for many of you going into clinical fields. And some important names, particularly if you're going to take pharmacology. This is when you're going to hear some terms that are going to blow you away. One is called, they're sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're going to hear about sympathomimetic and sympatholytic, parasympathomimetic and parasympatholytic medications. I'm giving it to you now. You're going to be way ahead of the game when they snow you with this, many of you in pharmacology. Sympathomimetic, it mimics the sympathetic. And you know a ton of people will have to do that. They have a thing called an EpiPen. Easy context. Start to get, this is what we're talking about. This is why this is so darn important. See, I told my wife I was going to not swear constantly. Optimal shuns blood to areas that need it, adjusts the heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, operates via subconscious control, involuntary, general, visceral motor system. Same illustration you've seen, table. It's technically part of the peripheral nervous system. It's the motor division. Autonomic basically mean going to the viscera. And again, two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. You will see the anatomical construct. The big player in this, when you get to the sympathetic, you already learned about. It's called the vagus nerve. It's the only cranial nerve that leaves the head and neck area. I'm sure you learned that. It goes inside. That's what they called it. It got its name Vagus from that. Vagus is short for vagabond. It's a wandering nerve. You do that. So motor fibers, both have motor fibers, but different in the way they affect things, different pathways, where all the cell bodies are located, and the target organ responses to certain neurotransmitters. Good news. Don't have to thank me. This nervous system did it already. The main player in this is acetylcholine. Happy dance. And now you're going to learn some other pharmacology stuff, called cholinergics and anticholinergics and adrenergics. Because the other thing is called norepinephrine, used to be called noradrenaline. So you're going to hear about different kinds of receptors, okay, called alphas and betas. This is part of what's coming to you. That's why this is important, because this is the primer. Most of our medications pharmacologically interact with the autonomic nervous system. Most. So somatic nervous system, your body, skeletal muscles, indirectly joints, things like the autonomic, cardiac, smooth, and glands. So we'll look at it. The cell body is in the central nervous system and the somatic nervous system, okay? And a single thick myelinated group A axon extends in the spinal or cranial nerves directly to the muscle. Buy that. Don't have to know that. Autonomic nervous system. It has different terminology. You're going to have to go with it. It's a two-nerve circuit, strictly motor. Basically, you're going to see it goes from two different areas, one of two different areas. So it's typically going to be going from either the brain or the spinal cord. You have first nerve we call preganglionic. They all have a ganglia, a cluster of cell bodies. The nerve over here called postganglionic. That goes to wherever the target is. Typically an organ, a gland. And this, the connector, is the ganglia. You're going to become very familiar with this. You learned about cranial nerves, right? Did Dr. Robbins happen to talk to you at all about the 4 cranial nerves that are involved in the parasympathetic nervous system? Yep. Go back and look up the names 3, 7, 9, 10 in Vegas. 3 oculomotor, 7 is facial, 9 is glossopharyngeal, and 10 is the aforementioned vagus. You need to be familiar with those. I'll explain what they do when we get there. This is really important because this is part of the physical exam that many of you are going to have to learn how to do, physical assessment. That's what's coming up first semester of next year. So a 2-nerve circuit, cell body in the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord, preganglionic, and then outside of it, postganglionic. And you'll see that. It's there. Let us stop here. In the interest of keeping you sane and see everybody Wednesday. There's a lot to cover in the next couple of days. I'll make sure we all get it in. Maybe there'll be some overlap on Monday, but we'll get it in. Thank you. Goodbye. Have fun. Again, let me know what your decision is vis-a-vis the final. Even if you're not taking the final, you should be here listening to this stuff. Like I said, this is important stuff.